Caligula. He's the ultimate model for sociopaths everywhere. The young Roman emperor had an unenviable reputation as a sadist, a murderer, and a raving lunatic.
The emperor's decided that he's going to declare war on the sea god Neptune. It's mad!
There are stories of women and children, innocents, being thrown off the cliffs to their death.
But was he really as black as he's painted? We can now use ancient historical records to uncover the real Caligula. Investigators will put his turbulent life under the microscope using a wide range of scientific tests. New archaeological evidence will show for the first time the location of his violent assassination. And a leading forensic psychiatrist will analyze his character. The results of the tests will reveal whether he was mad or just plain bad, and compared with other tyrants in history, how he measures up against other ancients behaving badly. The Emperor Caligula became the supreme ruler of Rome at the age of 24. He held power for less than 4 years before being assassinated. In that brief time, he committed unspeakable atrocities, acts of cruelty that would ensure him a place in history as a complete madman.
Caligula is very psychiatrically disturbed. His behavior includes murder, killing without remorse, and pushing every moral bound placed in front of him.
But was he actually insane? To understand Caligula better, psychiatrist David Mallet will examine his behavior and then attempt to rank him against other tyrants in history like Genghis Khan, Julius Caesar, and more recently Hitler's Nazi henchmen Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring. Caligula's record is shocking, even by the standards of the time. He hosted magnificent feasts and had criminals beheaded between courses to amuse his guests. And while they nervously knocked back the wine, he raped their wives. Scandalously, high-ranking members of the Roman nobility were flogged and executed as a public spectacle, and a warning. He even slaughtered members of his own family. The horror stories are so extreme they're difficult to believe. Is the historical record to be trusted?
Our information about the reign of Caligula comes from two sources: Philo, a contemporary, and Suetonius. And it's Suetonius that gives us some of the most shocking, lurid details and stories that took place in the reign of terror of Caligula. Now, he's writing over 70 years later. And that's like someone today writing about World War I. But he's got way less evidence.
The hunt for evidence about Caligula begins with his childhood. He was born in 12 AD and given the noble name Gaius Germanicus Augustus.
Gaius was the son of Germanicus, golden boy of the imperial family, who was essentially a military hero talked about in the same breath as Alexander the Great. And basically, Gaius is an army brat.
As a boy, Gaius spent his early years living in a place similar to this, a Roman army fort.
He parades around the camp in a tiny military costume made for him by his mother. And the soldiers love it. They even give him a nickname, Caligula, which means little boots, after the tiny military sandals he used to wear.
When little Caligula snapped his fingers, even battle-hardened soldiers had to obey his every whim.
Imagine what that does to you. Your father's a hero, you've been spoiled all your life, and you can basically do no wrong.
This was the incubator for Caligula's explosive temper. Dr. Mallet's case study exposes the impact it had on the boy.
Caligula's childhood had a tremendous formative effect on his character. It was a world turned upside down. Instead of a child being surrounded by adults, this was a kid who was being bowed down to by the people around him, being told that he could do no wrong, no moral compass being presented to him. He wasn't a child, he was the general.
Clearly, it wasn't a good start, and it got worse. At that time, the Roman Empire was ruled by Tiberius, a cruel and depraved old scoundrel. He was similar to dictators like Hitler and Stalin, in that he was heavily reliant on a secret police force that kept files on anyone who posed a threat, real or imagined. And the most bulging file was on Germanicus, Caligula's father.
You got to remember, Germanicus is a war hero, which really means a lot to the Romans. And he's also next in line to the throne. Tiberius, on the other hand, is just a twisted, unpopular old man. And he's so paranoid that he's deeply suspicious of Germanicus.
Caligula was only 7 when Germanicus, fit and in the prime of life, came down with a mysterious illness and died. It was all very suspicious. The histories say Tiberius poisoned him, but there's no proof of this. If it was murder, it would have had an enormous psychological effect on Caligula. Modern medical science can now answer the question, was it murder? Toxicologist Dr. Timothy Erickson has read the historical account and found 2 significant clues. A robotic patient simulator helps explain his analysis.
We know from Germanicus' accounts that he had skin findings that were blotchy. These accounts are quite descriptive. The other very important account historically of Germanicus' death is he was foaming at the mouth immediately before his death. Nowadays we know this is consistent with arsenic poisoning.
But arsenic poisoning can be mistaken for a common and lethal disease.
What's classically described with arsenic poisoning is a rice water-like diarrhea, where you're losing so much volume through the diarrhea that it appears like rice in water. Most accounts would call that cholera, so it's another way to get people off the suspicious trail of arsenic.
Arsenic poisoning masquerading as cholera? It's a possible explanation.
He goes into heart failure. And then the body completely shuts down and he dies.
No one at the time, including Caligula, believed Germanicus died of natural causes.
The death of Germanicus has a tremendous effect on the young Caligula. He sees his father, a great military leader, die. This likely led him to this fatalistic, perhaps nihilistic view of the world. My father was great, he died young. I'm likely to meet the same fate.
For the following 12 years, Caligula lived in complete isolation with his grandmother. We've discovered nothing written about this period of his life. But what happened next makes the murder of his father look like a minor episode. Tiberius summoned him to the island of Capri, now a beautiful resort, but then a place that held great terror for visitors.
I'm rushing to catch the ferry to get to the island of Capri. I want to explore there, what impact being there had on the life of Caligula. And I really want to hurry up because there's a storm coming.
The Isle of Capri lies 130 miles south of Rome, in the Mediterranean, a short distance from the coast. The island location gave Tiberius considerable protection from attack.
We've arrived in Capri and the mood is gloomy, overcast, dark.
Like the lair of the villain in a James Bond film, Tiberius's palace was perched on the highest, most inaccessible peak on the island. Caligula had no idea why he'd been summoned, but what happened there would change him forever. "19-year-old Caligula arrived at the island fastness of the depraved and paranoid emperor Tiberius. Caligula had no idea why he'd been summoned, but he probably feared the worst. This is the path Caligula would have taken to Tiberius's hilltop palace. He would have undoubtedly been very nervous. Why? Because Tiberius ruled most of the known world and routinely killed off anyone he perceived as a threat. He had already murdered Caligula's father and his two brothers.
When I think of Caligula making his way here, I think of him having trepidation and fear and uncertainty. His family members have been killed by Tiberius. Is he next?
Only the ruins of the palace survive today, but what Caligula saw was a towering fortress, a nightmarish place and the site of unspeakable atrocities.
Roman society is violent and graphic. People are used to the arena. People are used to condemned criminals being killed. Here, Tiberius is not subject to the public scrutiny. Here, Tiberius can do whatever he wants. And the stories of this recluse, this kind of Howard Hughes, are fantastical. And he's a depraved, dirty, sick, twisted old man. And Caligula finds himself on Capri, trapped. There's no way out. Only the emperor will allow you to come and to go.
Caligula now received a masterclass in depravity.
Caligula has to go along with whatever takes place in this villa.
Tiberius enjoyed creative and imaginative ways of abusing, torturing, and killing his victims.
I'm at what's known as Tiberius's Leap. And it's over 1,000 feet above the sea level. And it's from here, we are told that Tiberius has condemned criminals, people he doesn't like, thrown off the cliffs to their death. We are told if they still survived, there were people down below in boats with oars. If someone popped up above the surface alive, their heads would be smashed with the oars.
Tiberius's leap wasn't reserved for criminals alone.
There are stories of women and children, innocents, being thrown off just for the pleasure of Tiberius. Caligula would have witnessed all of this.
Even for Romans familiar with violent and gruesome rituals, murdering women and children in cold blood was going too far. And according to the historians, there was more, much more. Orgies, rape, pedophilia, torture, the whole catalogue of sadistic and depraved behavior.
The stories tell us that Caligula abandons himself and participates in all kinds of sexual perversions and horrific acts.
Capri has an overwhelming effect on Caligula. He learns that life is worthless. He learns that the purpose of life is the pursuit of pure pleasure. And he learns to marry pure pleasure with violence.
Caligula sank ever deeper into this twisted mental state.
He now begins to identify with Tiberius. I want to be like Tiberius.
He wanted to be Tiberius, the man who had killed his family and was now holding him captive. It's like an early version of Stockholm Syndrome. Caligula has bonded with the beast. He grew to crave what Tiberius enjoyed, absolute power.
Caligula learns what absolute power is. He sees from Capri the empire, and he wants it.
And he soon got it, because Tiberius died, suddenly. The historian Suetonius called it murder, and named the killer as Caligula. There's no independent proof of this, but Caligula certainly benefited from the old monster's demise. Rule over the empire passed jointly to him and to Tiberius's grandson Gemellus. But Gemellus was only 18, too young to wield power. AD 37, Caligula was 24 and had the world at his feet.
Tiberius is dead. Caligula is now the emperor. He makes his way to Rome on this very road, on the Via Appia. And the crowds turned out. They were excited, they were jubilant, they were ready to see a new beginning and their new emperor.
The first thing he did was distance himself from the hated Tiberius.
Caligula makes his way into the Forum, where he very publicly burns the secret files that Tiberius kept on Roman citizens. This is a grand moment. It's as if the KGB files are getting burned in public. This is a new beginning, and the crowd is enthusiastic about this move. Little do they know that Caligula has kept backup files of those same records.
Caligula then slavishly pandered to the base desires of the plebeian masses in an attempt to buy their love.
Roman society is basically divided into two groups: the ruling class, the educated people, the extremely wealthy people. Right? That's one group of people. The other is the plebs, the commoners, the mob. And you've got to keep them satisfied. You've got to keep them happy. And one way in which Caligula is doing that, and becomes quite notorious for doing so, is giving away money. How much money? Up to 2.7 billion bronze coins. And he's doing that in venues like the Basilica Julia, going to the top of the structure and throwing them down to the masses who are eagerly awaiting to scoop them up and take them home.
For 8 months all went well. Then Caligula changed abruptly. Almost overnight, the benevolent dictator became a hysterical monster, a Tiberius clone. He turned on his people in an orgy of bloodletting.
Caligula holds exquisite, elaborate banquets as the emperor. Ordinarily, this was an absolutely fantastic social highlight. But with Caligula, during the festivities, in front of the guests, there are flayings, there are killings.
And suddenly there was a lot of blood on the exquisite tablecloths. The historian Suetonius says that's when it got worse.
He would sometimes remove the wives of distinguished guests, take them away, rape them, and then bring them back to the banquet and discuss the sexual performance. This is outrageous. He thinks he can get away with it, and he's right.
Caligula had no scruples about abusing the Roman aristocracy, his own class. Noble citizens who crossed him were beaten, tortured, and put to death in the public arenas. Even at the height of his bloodlust, Tiberius never did this. But can these stories be true? One report describes how Caligula changed the rules of the gladiatorial games.
Gladiators are divided into different types based on the armour and weapons they use. And people would support a different type of gladiator, a bit like they support football teams today. Now, Caligula's favourite gladiator was a Thracian, who was a quite lightly armoured gladiator, and he was usually pitted against a Murmillo who had more armour.
The rules were the rules, and for 300 years no Roman emperor had presumed to interfere with them.
It would be like changing the rules of the NFL. Everyone else will hate your guts.
But Caligula, the story goes, wanted longer, bloodier contests with more pain. So he decreed that one of the pair of gladiators would carry less protection. Would this work? Or would the more lightly armored fighter be killed off more quickly? To find out, two combat experts are wearing authentic gladiatorial armor. Even at the start, there's not very much of it. Army Doctor Fred Galvin is on hand to assess the injuries.
Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to be removing the arm guard from this gladiator. What we're going to end up having exposed now is going to be his biceps, triceps, forearm muscles, wrist. Wow, that would have been a telling strike. You can see where it would have cut through the muscle groups of the biceps and the triceps. As bad as this injury is, it certainly is not as critical as an injury along the inside of the forearm, which is where the arteries and veins run through the arm. Although bloody, this injury would not have ended the fight.
Next, Fred takes away the gladiator's shield.
This was a superficial slash across the abdomen. No vital structures in his abdominal area were struck. For example, his liver in this area, or his spleen located up here. Lungs on either side of the chest, and the heart located in this central region, they were not affected by this blow. It was a superficial slash across the abdominal muscles, and he will continue to fight another day.
The Thracian could probably dispatch his opponent at any time. But if he didn't put on the drawn-out bloody spectacle Caligula demanded, the emperor wouldn't allow him to leave the arena alive. In terms of atrocious behavior, Caligula was a master. The question remains, what was it that transformed him into a monster? Historical sources blame it on a mysterious illness. Now, modern medical science may be able to reveal the truth. Rome AD 37. 25-year-old Caligula had suddenly turned into a violent and ruthless dictator. 2,000-year-old historical sources blame this change in his behavior on a mysterious illness. Today, more specific causes can be proposed and tested. A sudden personality change suggests brain damage. Romans, however, saw it as punishment from the gods. Modern neurology points the finger at Caligula's licentious lifestyle. The two chief suspects, alcohol and sex. The sexually transmitted disease herpes, in particular, can lead to the brain-damaging disease herpes encephalitis.
Herpes encephalitis likes to attack the frontal lobes. The frontal lobe is thought to be involved in your expression of emotion and how well you can inhibit impulses.
Frontal lobe damage can cause changes in behavior.
Very extreme emotional behavior, so periods of extreme elation, periods of extreme sadness, inappropriateness, sexual inappropriateness, violent or aggressive behavior to other people.
Caligula's behavior was symptomatic of herpes encephalitis. But there's a problem. Even with modern medicine, 3/4 of patients suffering this disease die. 2,000 years ago, Caligula's chance of surviving it would have been even less good. So if it wasn't herpes, what about alcohol? The suspected substance in this case is something uniquely Roman, because this is not a simple case of alcohol poisoning. The possible culprit is a sweet, boiled-down grape juice called defrutum that the Romans added to their wine.
They were making a dry wine, which probably wasn't all that good compared to modern technology, and they used the defrutum to sweeten it up so it became more palatable.
Terence is making up a batch of defrutum exactly as the Romans would have done. What makes defrutum suspect is not the ingredients, but the cooking method. The ingredients are boiled in a pot lined with lead.
They felt that any brass or brazen pots, as they call them, would spoil the juice that they're making.
The hazards of using lead in cooking were not realized at the time. So the question is, how much lead was there in defrutum? Chemical analysis will now give us the answer.
This is amazing because no one's actually, to my knowledge, taken the extract, done the process, and then tested it for lead. Back then, they appreciated the flavor of lead. It was almost like chocolate syrup on their food.
The sample is analyzed in a mass spectrometer. and the lead levels are compared against a sample of modern wine.
Okay, so average wines today, you take any wine off the shelf, it's going to be less than 200 parts per billion, and that's what's permissible. If it's less than 200, it's okay to sell.
Okay, well, let's look at the fruitum.
Wow.
29,000 ppb.
That's huge. It is packed with lead. I mean, it really gives you a wallop. I knew it would be elevated. I didn't know how high the levels would be, and quite honestly, they're much higher than anticipated.
So there's more than enough lead into fruitum to cause chronic lead poisoning.
Once the patient starts getting really lead intoxicated or lead poisoning, then you start seeing the altered personalities, the delirium, the confusion. Could it have accounted for the personality changes, deficits, the radical behavior of Caligula? I think so.
But Caligula wasn't the only Roman who drank a lot of wine, so there's an assumption that many people must have suffered lead poisoning. One historical account offers an explanation for Caligula's particular symptoms. Philo reported that after taking power, his drinking became excessive even by liberal Roman standards. The lead he consumed must have added a new dimension of derangement to his already disturbed personality. While Caligula lay moaning in bed, crowds took to the streets to show their adoration for their ailing young emperor. Perhaps they should have stayed at home.
During Caligula's illness, many people made vows for his speedy recovery. One such person who made an oath was a certain plebeian, Publius Afranius Politus, and he offered his life for the life of Caligula. When Caligula recovers, he takes the man literally. He has him dressed up like a sacrificial animal, he has him with garlands and wreaths, and throws him over the city walls.
That done, Caligula turned on Gemellus, his co-emperor.
Caligula realizes, more than ever, Gemellus is only a heartbeat away from the throne. He is his co-ruler, although Caligula was the favorite of Tiberius. He has to be eliminated. Caligula accuses Gemellus of treason. The punishment for this is death.
Many tyrants have used show trials to cloak the murder of their opponents, but Caligula didn't bother with the legal niceties. All he offered Gemellus was the chance to die privately at home.
Gemellus is now being forced to commit suicide, and Caligula sends his goons over to make sure the job gets done.
What was going on in Caligula's fevered brain? Dr. Mallet thinks he had a severe case of extreme narcissism.
He views himself as this grandiose, omnipotent figure. The dangers of a narcissistic personality is this inability to treat others with any level of empathy. He is in some ways a kind of ancient slasher movie.
Caligula had become a monster, so out of control that he decided to challenge the gods themselves. In Roman times that was unthinkable, but Caligula was clearly beyond all reason. In the heart of ancient Rome stands one of its most sacred buildings, the Temple of Castor and Pollux. Suetonius reported that Caligula turned this holy place into the foyer of his palace.
A modern equivalent of such an action is if someone were to build a huge residence right next to the Vatican, bash a hole into it, and then use the Vatican as a vestibule, use the Vatican as a dining room area. You know, hang out lights and disco balls and have big parties. It's that absurd, it's that crazy.
It was such an outrage that subsequent historians didn't believe it. But in 2003, Darius and his team finally revealed the truth. The excavation site here is now filled in, but what they found was astonishing.
right in this area we have definitely some Caligulan structures that are part of the palace. Now, coming forward in this direction, our excavations revealed here where the portico is, massive foundations. They continue in this direction. They draw all the way extending to the back of the temple of Castor and Pollux. So what we have is massive foundations extending from where we know the Julio-Claudians are building palaces. We know that Caligula is involved, coming all the way to this point, butting up against the backside of the temple in Castor and Pollux, as the sources say.
This suggests that the story everyone refused to believe for 2,000 years is actually true. It seems that not even the gods could deter Caligula. He then embarked on a journey that the sources say point to something even worse, that the emperor was stark raving mad. AD 39. 27-year-old Caligula ruled Rome with a rod of iron. However, absolute power over the empire didn't satisfy him. He desired to ensure his place in history by proving himself a great general.
You need to understand that Rome's a military state, and there's one hard and fast rule: great leaders win battles. If you want respect in Rome, you have to go out and kick barbarian butt, and you have to do it spectacularly. Now, on top of that, Caligula's under the shadow of his father, Germanicus, who's a military hero, and he's desperate to get out from under that shadow. Basically, he's desperate to prove himself as a military leader.
So Caligula decided to conduct a military campaign more than 1,000 miles from Rome at the northern fringe of the empire. Suetonius describes how after 8 months, Caligula returned to Rome telling an extraordinary story, that he'd conquered Britain. Even Julius Caesar hadn't managed to do that. Suetonius also said that Caligula had concocted a crude hoax to prove he'd conquered the territory. He paraded captured Britons through the streets of Rome, including a warrior chieftain.
There's a strong suspicion that the captives aren't really captives at all, that they're slaves of Caligula's who've been dressed up to look like barbarians. And the British chieftain was probably a turncoat who fled to the emperor for protection. But according to Suetonius, that's not Caligula's most outrageous act here. Imagine you're one of the legionaries ready to embark on the beach here for the invasion of Britain, and all of a sudden you get the instruction that you're to march out there and you're to gather cockle shells. Because instead of invading Britain, the emperor's decided that he's going to declare war on the sea god Neptune.
If this story is true, it's the act of a lunatic. But did it really happen? Suetonius was writing 70 years after the event, under a new imperial administration that needed to discredit Caligula's military claims. So what really happened? The answer lies 200 miles away on the banks of the Rhine in Holland. There are a number of Roman forts here used by the Emperor Claudius to launch an invasion of Britain 3 years after Caligula's campaign. Recent research by a Dutch archaeological team has cast new light on the origins of the forts. The team dates the timbers in the forts by their tree rings. This technique is called dendrochronology. It uses the fact that every piece of wood has a unique pattern, like a barcode.
We do know the sequence of those barcodes, so to say, from 6000 BC to the present day. So when you've got the code for this particular piece of wood, you just compare it to the known sequence, and then you get an absolute match for AD 40. And even the season, winter AD 40.
The dating is so precise that it confirms the forts were built exactly at the time Caligula was here. So they were not built by Claudius. The team discovers something else on the site, showing that Caligula was planning something ambitious. Money. And lots of it.
During the excavations of the fort, we found about 700 coins, and over half of them had been minted in Caligula's reign. What you see here is a coin issued in the reign of Caligula with a portrait of Caligula, We've got about 80 or 100 of these coins that were found in Alphen, and that is really unusual. It gives a clear evidence that at this particular period in his reign, a large amount of money was needed in this area.
It appears Caligula did build a chain of forts here, and he had a lot of money to fund a campaign. Dr. Kemmer's analysis is clear.
Why they built the fort here in Caligula's reign is to control the supply lines and to have kind of storage bases where they could store the supplies needed for the big invasion. The River Rhine is a perfect transport route from the Mediterranean. Well, it starts in the Alps, but you could use the Rhone from the Mediterranean, move over to the Rhine, bring your troops and supplies over the Rhine to the North Sea coast, and from there launch an invasion to Britain.
It's not known why Caligula didn't carry through the invasion plan, but 3 years later, Claudius did invade Britain, using his forts as bases. So Caligula's strategy was obviously well thought out.
I think the evidence for actually Caligula preparing an invasion in Britain forces us to reevaluate him in a way. He's always looked at as a madman, and his entire undertaking of going to Britain is dismissed as being quite irreliable. But definitely something big was going on in his reign, so it wasn't a disaster after all. I think real things happened. Important things happened, and not just the acts of a mad boy.
Caligula is not insane. He's not psychotic. He was able to plan, lead, and execute a complicated military operation. This was a detailed, goal-directed endeavor. And in psychosis, what you do not see is goal-directedness.
So the ability to design a credible plan to invade Britain, including the construction of forts, indicates the ruthless, tyrannical Caligula was actually sane. But that was not going to save him from destiny. During his short reign, he had made too many enemies.
The ancient sources tell us that Caligula is abusing his Praetorian guards. He's making fun of one for an effeminate voice. He's making fun of another one by sleeping with his wife. This is utter madness. These are the people that have your backs. These are the people that are protecting your life and limb.
Caligula seems to have secretly harbored a death wish. On a cold January day in 41 AD, he attended the Palatine Games. Excited crowds filled the theatre and spilled out onto the streets. The atmosphere was highly charged and electric. At lunchtime, Caligula left the arena. He entered an underground passage called a crypto-portico and set off towards his palace. He wouldn't reach it alive.
This kind of crypto-portico or underground passageway would link you, like in a maze, from one point of the palace to another. And this is a great discovery that's been made in recent years.
For almost 2,000 years, these passageways have lain undiscovered. Archaeologists found them in 2006. And this is the first time cameras have been allowed inside. The first passages discovered were built sometime after the reign of Caligula. But as the historians dug further, a find was made that changed everything.
This is one of the more recent excavation sites. And right here was an important discovery. It says on this lead pipe, this water pipe, Tiberius, Claudius, Caesar, Augustus. Who is Claudius? The successor of Caligula. So we're getting closer and closer to the realities of Caligula. So this is a precious, precious document that means that the archaeologists today are reconsidering the entire dating of this complex.
2 years after this discovery was made, the archaeologists ventured even deeper.
This cryptoporticus is older than the cryptoporticus we've seen. The corridor that Caligula passes through on his way from celebrating the games on the Palatine Hill. We're told that he goes through a cryptoporticus on the Palatine Hill in his palace like this, and he finds himself isolated, away from his bodyguard, away from his retinue, alone.
These are the corridors the emperor actually walked down on the last day of his short, turbulent life. In the shadows waited two bodyguards, Cassius Chaerea, who Caligula mocked mercilessly on account of his high-pitched voice, and Sabinus, whose wife Caligula had raped.
And that is when the conspirators strike. Cassius Chaerea and Sabinus find him here, and they strike the blow. Caligula dies on the ground in a pool of blood.
Caligula had been emperor for 3 years, 8 months, and 10 days. He was just 29 years old. In that brief time, he turned the Roman people's love for him into hate and revulsion. He lived for violence. He enjoyed watching the massacre of helpless women and children. He made the bloody gladiatorial games even more cruel. He raped and he murdered. Where does such behavior of an ancient behaving badly put him on the psychopathic scale of tyrants? Although Caligula might have murdered people in order to gain power at the start, most of the violence he perpetrated was for his own entertainment. This psychopathic behavior puts Caligula at the opposite end of the scale to calculating, goal-driven killers like Julius Caesar and Genghis Khan. For them, killing was a necessary part of their aim of achieving and also maintaining power.
He would be very high on a psychopathic scale. His killing without remorse, murder without guilt, inability to see the rights of anybody else around him. This man is a stone-cold psychopath.
But there's another vital aspect of Caligula's personality that sets him apart from others: his extreme narcissism.
He would score very high on a scale of narcissism, shown by his inflated sense of self-importance, his lack of empathy of others, his need for adulation.
So who in history has a similar personality profile?
I would look to some of Hitler's henchmen, such as Himmler or Goering, for a comparison, in that they combine this narcissistic self-importance, this tremendous inflated self-esteem, coupled with this tremendous psychopathy and lack of remorse whenever people died.
Take psychopathic tendencies, mix them with a large element of narcissism, and you get one of history's truly terrifying personality combinations. Made more frightening still by the fact that Caligula's evil mind was so cold and calculating. Despite the brevity of his reign, Caligula cast a long shadow. Tiberius hid his depravity behind closed doors. Caligula paraded his in public. Fear of Caligula lingered long after his death. What if the assassination had been faked? Perhaps the evil emperor was watching in the shadows to see who cheered, and so who would be next on his death list.